Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Foreign Policy Panel on Global Migration, Refugee Crisis, and Trafficking in Persons. This panel would explore the global migration crisis focusing in Latin America, the intersection between migration and trafficking in persons, and the different diplomatic and foreign assistance tools to address this issue. My name is Lucia Gallegos. I am a contractor with Cherokee Federal and serve as a program advisor at the Department of State's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, and I will be the panel moderator today. Before I introduce our wonderful panelists today, please make sure you leave your questions for the panelists in the chat. We will try to select a couple of questions to answer at the end. Let's make sure we are all respectful to each other. Now I'm going to start introducing our panel. Our first panelist is Amy Rustin Haslett. Amy joined the State Department in 2008 and has worked in a variety of roles, including managing Spanish language academic exchange programs at the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, covering the Haiti portfolio for the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, coordinating foreign assistance for Africa in the Office of Foreign Assistance, and as a program officer, Bureau Strategic Planner, and manager in the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. In her current capacity as Deputy Senior Coordinator for International Programs, she leads a global team in implementing programs to combat human trafficking in all regions. Prior to joining the State Department, Amy served in the Peace Corps in Cabo Verde and worked at the Latin American Youth Center in Washington, D.C. And Amy is a proud Cuban American. Our next panelist is Kayla Hull Morgan. Kayla began her 20-year federal career with the Bureau of Diplomatic Security, or DS, of the Department of State as a Presidential Management Fellow, with the Office of Intelligence and Threat Analysis in the Western Hemisphere Division, covering Central America and the Caribbean as a Foreign Affairs Officer. She then served as a Special Assistant to the Executive Director for DS. She is the founding manager for the Victims Resource Advocacy Program established in 2010, now in the DS Office of Special Investigations, whose mission is to empower those who have been victimized as a result of crimes investigated by DS. Mrs. Hull Morgan is a licensed attorney, clinical social worker, and clinical therapist. Our next panelist, Supervisory Special Agent Ryan LeBranche. Ryan is Human Trafficking Investigations Coordinator, or HTIC, for the Department of State's Diplomatic Security Service, or DSS. The HTIC is responsible for DSS's human trafficking policy, interagency coordination, and operational strategy. Ryan joined DSS in October 2010. His assignments include the Boston Field Office, Secretary of State's Protective Detail, Kathmandu, Peshawar, Cape Town, and the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining DSS, Ryan was an intelligence officer in the U.S. Army. He's a graduate of UMass Amherst and has an MPA from the University of Oklahoma. David Tagle. David is a political Foreign Service officer currently serving at the U.S. Embassy in Kampala. In his previous assignments, he has worked on human rights, migration, rule of law, and regional security issues in Latin America. He began his career at the department as a Presidential Management Fellow. And last but not least, Joshua Yule. Joshua is a Foreign Affairs Officer who leads on the governance pillar on the strategy team in the Office for Central American Affairs. The strategy team implements the administration's root causes strategy to address irregular migration. Prior to the strategy team, Joshua has worked at the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons and the admissions team in the Bureau of Population and Refugee and Migration. All right, so we are going to get started and we'll address a couple of questions at the end of the panel. My first question is for Josh. How have the U.S. diplomatic efforts evolved over the years to collaborate with international organizations and civil society in addressing the global refugee crisis, particularly in Latin America? And what international variables might be credited with these changes?
Hi, Lucia. No, thank you. And your question reminds me of when I started in the admissions team, and my office was working on the Central American Minors Program, which was a refugee admissions program for minors from Central America, as the name states. Um, but while I think many of the drivers and structural issues of migration may be constant, the migration flows themselves are changing. And I think today we are focused on, and it is US policy to work with countries in the region to build safe communities so that migration is a choice. And we do that both on two fronts, both on making sure that those who are migrating have safe migration options. But as you mentioned, on the strategy team, that we do invest and work with countries to address the structural root causes of that, which goes from economic development to promoting good governance, focusing on human rights and gender-based violence, as well as the security situation. So our policy, there's different initiatives and approaches over the years, but I think we stand committed, especially now, to make sure that, as I said, people have safe mobility options, and that we are addressing the drivers and the root causes of migration.
Thank you, Josh. David, I know you also have some experience working in the region. Also would like to see your perspective on this question.
Yeah, thanks, Lucia. Yeah, Josh, summed it up very well. I'd say as far as the question on, how has kind of the approach to U.S. efforts changed over the years, I think a lot of that has kind of been a result of changing, attitudes, and also the development of human rights norms, international human rights norms in organizations, primarily through the United Nations. The U.S., the State Department, we've engaged a lot with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, as we will reference UNHCR and other international organizations, for example, in Latin America, the Organization of American States, in addressing kind of the global refugee crisis. Over the years, I think there's been a heightened attention on refugee crisis and migration, partially because there is greater access to information, whether it was, newspapers, access to television, obviously now with widespread internet and social media, people are just more aware of kind of the various causes and drivers of migration and other causes of the refugee crisis. I'd say also just the proliferation and growth of civil society organizations and non-governmental organizations internationally, both domestically in the US and internationally, have played a large role in kind of shining a light on refugees, on migrants. They've played a really large role in advocacy and implementing programs, providing research, that the department really, we seek to engage with these groups when we're forming our policies. So, that's, I think, a lot of the reason for, kind of a global shift in attitudes towards refugees. And I think also just, there's lots of variables that kind of fed into this, whether it's civil wars in Central America in the 80s, natural disasters, in the 90s and 2000s in countries such as Honduras, El Salvador, and Haiti, global economic recession, political instability. We've seen that really recently with Venezuela. And of course, the global pandemic, has also played a role. So, we'll continue to see shifts, but those have been kind of some of the causes for the changes over the years. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now I'm going to ask a question related to trafficking in persons, and this question is going to be for Amy. Could you elaborate on the intersection between migration and trafficking in persons? And how has the Department of State employed diplomatic and foreign assistance tools to combat human trafficking in Latin America?
Hi, Lucia. Thank you for that great question. So we often see migration patterns consisting of a mix of economic migrants, asylum seekers, smuggling, and human trafficking. Through the course of migration, migrants may find themselves in vulnerable positions at different points along their journey. For example, migrants may run out of money to complete a final leg in the journey and may need to seek employment in the informal economy, where they're highly vulnerable to human trafficking due to, for example, being underage, a lack of work permits, language barriers, etc. Or a smuggler may force migrants to engage in forced labor or a commercial sex act in order to generate revenue, which changes the nature of smuggling crime against a state to a human trafficking crime against an individual. Of course, not all migrants are victims of human trafficking, and not all smuggling cases involve trafficking, but there can be significant overlap. The Trafficking in Persons report produced by our office is our primary diplomatic tool to engage foreign governments on human trafficking. The TIP report highlights the efforts of 188 governments around the world, including the United States. Staff in our office travel throughout the year to meet with foreign government officials to encourage action to prevent human trafficking, protect victims, prosecute traffickers, and to enhance partnerships to meet the minimum standards to combat trafficking in persons. We also utilize these exchanges to understand emerging trends and how the crime manifests in countries, regions, and globally. On the foreign assistance side, our office currently has over 81 million invested in active programming in 21 countries in the Western Hemisphere. Our projects include short-term targeted training and technical assistance, emergency assistance for victims, and longer comprehensive investments designed to create systemic change in a given country's approach to combating human trafficking. A few recent achievements of our programming include, for example, in Guatemala, supporting our implementing partners to open the first shelter for male victims of trafficking. In Ecuador, our partnership with an international organization led to the approval of Ecuador's new law on trafficking in persons and migrant smuggling. And one last example, in Costa Rica, our programming established 13 multidisciplinary teams that now work to respond to cases of child sex trafficking.
Thank you so much, Amy. It's great to see the work that's doing the TIP office to address human trafficking. And Josh, you've also been at the TIP office for a few years, so I'd be curious to know if you also have anything to say on this question.
Yeah, no, thank you, Lucia and Amy. It's great to hear some of the shout out from some of my old projects. But when I think of migration and TIP, I think to add to this conversation and nuance, how I frame this is not to also think that in certain countries you have internal migrants, people within their country who are moving. We do have people in the region who migrate. Not only, I think we think of a lot of migration patterns northwards, but there are other migration patterns, people intra-regional migrants. And I know from my time at the TIP office, I have seen cases of foreign nationals being exploited in other Latin American countries. And you have those who are third country nationals on their way transiting a country. And every time you're a foreign national, and I think the human rights literature talks about this, it just adds more vulnerabilities that people, traffickers, can use to exploit people. And I am very grateful for my time at JTIP to work on our programming that could address those, whether it was in this region, whether it was in Costa Rica or in Brazil. And I think the migration issue and thinking through a lens of understanding the vulnerabilities that could introduce and how we should best respond is a lens that we should always keep in mind when thinking about these issues. So thank you, Lucia.
Thank you both so much. And continuing a little bit on the topic of trafficking in persons, we would like to see how the different U.S. agencies are collaborating to address migration or human trafficking in the United States, particularly coming from South and Central America. In this question, I would like to hear from Ryan and Kayla first, and also from later from Amy on her perspective.
Thanks. Well, I'll talk mostly to the law enforcement side. I'm a diplomatic security agent, so I'm the law enforcement wing in the State Department, and Kayla also works in diplomatic security with me. For the U.S. agencies, and specifically to combat trafficking, I could talk to you about all the task forces that we have to make sure that U.S. law enforcement is cooperating. But since we focus mainly on transnational trafficking, and that's where we would see a large portion of the issues that are coming from WHA and coming from the migration issues, it's super important for us to know that we cannot do this on our own. The traffickers and the people that take advantage of these vulnerable populations, they communicate really well. They often communicate a lot better than we can in the diplomacy world. Bad guys are really good at this. They don't need mutual legal assistance treaties. They don't need to go to summits. They can just talk to whomever they want to in order to advance their trafficking network. So the only way that we're really going to be able to combat that is if the global community, not just law enforcement, but our NGOs, the civil society, governments throughout the entire region can find ways to cooperate more efficiently. While we're working on big deals and big treaties, we need to be able to cooperate and communicate as efficiently as possible. And some of the ways that I've seen that the most effective are through programs such as the International Law Enforcement Academy, where a lot of the police leaders and a lot of the police that are maybe focused on a specific issue like trafficking or smuggling come together for various conferences, whether it's on leadership development, whether it's specifically on human trafficking, even on narcotics, even if it's not related. This gets them working together, gets them in a class, maybe much like a program you may be in college. It builds camaraderie. It builds those informal networks that will allow the passing of vital information to try to disrupt these trafficking networks. Likewise, just in that one small world, we can't just, only do law enforcement to law enforcement. You can't arrest your way out of a problem like this. It requires so many different things to work together, so many different mechanisms of that host nation government, their policies, the United States policies, the donor countries, the transit countries, the receiving countries, to work together to set the conditions that will allow the local law enforcement and local governments to combat trafficking. And it's one of the reasons why I really enjoy working in the State Department, because I get to work with the JTIP office. I get to work with INL. Our embassies overseas are doing what they can to set better conditions in those countries that dissuade people from leaving because there'll be more economic opportunities. Putting our information out through our consular colleagues so that people may know, because usually people that are about to be trafficked or about to get into a migrant situation that would make them very vulnerable to a dangerous smuggling situation or ultimately trafficking don't know that. They're just unaware of what they're getting into from the moment they walk in to apply for their visa. Being able to provide that information and educate up front is crucial. So I'm very, very proud when I sit back and look at the work that the U.S. government does in leading this global effort in the counter smuggling and counter trafficking community to try our best to improve conditions in foreign countries, to connect key stakeholders, and to make that connection between law enforcement and policy. So that would be the portion that I say is that it's a great question, but really it's to combat something like migration related issues, specifically trafficking. It's really got to be a global effort into U.S. agencies looking to leverage our partners overseas.
Hi, Lucia. Thank you. I will hop in as well for that on the second time. For the question you asked about collaboration, I'll give an example. Just this morning, I've been on no less than 2 interagency calls discussing our various efforts at focusing our attention to what we can do once victims are identified in cases and where we can turn. We talked a lot in several of the meetings about our mapping of different resource organizations and how we vet them. When I host individuals, whether they're on detail or as an intern or here working in state, what we do is focus on the capabilities, not just within, but what other federal law enforcement agencies have to offer and what our NGO community has to offer. And that changes almost daily. So I, as you mentioned, founded VRAP 14 years ago, and the whole of the federal government was just on the cusp of identifying the fact that we have to do more as far as resources, basic needs, looking at Maslow's hierarchy of our social infrastructure to support victims once they are identified. And so from over a decade ago, we've now gotten to having a lot of best practices that are able to be shared in some of the forums, such as Ryan mentioned. So I have been invited to several embassies, to several governments to present and lead and share how you build the infrastructure for an advocacy program so that other countries are able to take what works for them, use those best practices as models, and then create their own types of programs that not only identify the fact that there's an issue and that trafficking is a reality and that people are taken advantage of, but what do you do next? And ILEA, the law enforcement academies, I put in a component that we teach and that I led for VRAP on building that infrastructure with police departments on how they can be more victim centric. So between our senior policy operating groups that work together all the time, have listening sessions, and I want to point out the National Action Plan to Combat Human Trafficking that identifies diplomatic security, identifies VRAP, identifies other federal programs, and calls us to task on certain efforts that we must advance to make sure there are the support mechanisms in place within our government and collaboratively to identify and resource victims. We are consistently held to update that list and to make sure our efforts are captured. And then finally, with our NGO partners, what I make sure to do is to have that cultural sensitivity component when we identify a victim. So you talked about individuals who may be from Central America and South America. We'll work with targeted groups such as Ayuda and others that look to these communities to build in not just the housing and basic needs, but also that cultural network of support so that we are in collaboration as a federal government with what's available locally, state, and throughout the nation and world to support our client populations. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. Amy?
Thank you. Ms. Hall Morgan and Mr. LaBranche have handled this so well, but I'll just add a little bit more on the policy side. The United States has made the global fight against human trafficking a policy priority and employs a whole of government approach to stop human trafficking, protect victims, and prevent this crime. The President's Interagency Task Force to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, or the PITF, and its Senior Policy Operating Group that Ms. Hall Morgan just mentioned are the key forums through which the U.S. government has driven advancements in our anti-trafficking response for 2 decades. The PITF is a cabinet-level entity chaired by the Secretary of State and consists of 20 departments and agencies across the federal government responsible for coordinating efforts to combat human trafficking. And we also have several interagency working groups of the Department on Migration in the Western Hemisphere and the Nexus with Trafficking in Persons, including a TIP and migration working group led by our office.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you all of you for showing us how the U.S. government is collaborating to combat human trafficking. And now I have another question. This one is for Josh first, and then David. Josh, this may be a little bit related to the root strategy, but we would like to know what specific strategies and initiatives the Department of State is implementing to ensure a more prosperous, sustainable, democratic region, particularly in areas that are significant sources of migration, and how these efforts align with the broader U.S. foreign policy.
No, thank you for that. And I also just want to take a moment that also addressing these root causes in high migration sending areas and countries, and also promoting safe and orderly migration. We don't view that as mutually exclusive. And I'm going to talk on both because I think mentioning both of them is vitally important. And this summer, let me back up, because both are going on at the same time, right? So this summer, we announced the Safe Mobility Initiative. And part of that is we launched a website platform on Movilidad Segura. And we also have safe mobility offices in Colombia, Costa Rica, and Guatemala. And those are there to provide services and information. I believe Ryan talked about information as being one of the things we need to promote, those are there to help facilitate our goal of safe and orderly and humane migration, which I think how this ties back into broader refugee conversations is ties in pretty well. But we also have the root cause strategy, which, as you said, really gets to the heart of addressing a lot of the drivers in the region. And I want to highlight a few things, like the Biden-Harris administration elevated gender-based violence and human rights to its own pillars. We have 5 pillars under the strategy. Those make up 2, really showing the prioritization of addressing these as root causes. And while governance, you mentioned the lead on the governance angle, it's really woven throughout the strategy, because you can't have sustainable growth without good governance. So we take both addressing the root causes and the drivers of this as important. And while we at the policy shop drive that strategy forward, it is an interdepartmental and interagency effort to implement that. So USAID and our INL, our International Narcotics and Law Enforcement program, they fund projects in civil society throughout the region to promote and work on addressing the core pillars of this strategy. So I know maybe not this question, but others questions you asked about interagency and interdepartmental coordination, and this strategy really highlights that, because we rely on all of the funding offices to promote and use foreign assistance to promote projects that align with the strategic vision. So I hope that answers your question on what strategies we do, the safe mobility and the root cause strategy.
Thank you. David, also anything you would like to add?
Yeah, no, Josh definitely is, in the thick of things right now. So really great to hear that. I would just say, I'll just highlight a couple of other bureaus that I think my colleagues have already mentioned, but that do really great work. So, the department, we're a very large organization, but we have bureaus that we call functional bureaus that are focused on specific thematic areas. So one is the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. And, Josh is the governance lead. He works a lot with that. Basically, the Department of State through INL, we reference it, provide technical assistance and training to host country law enforcement, to prosecutors, to civil society. It's really interesting work and really impactful work. Anyone can always kind of debate which of these kind of root causes, whether it's governance or if it's economic development, are pushing migrants to seek safety outside of their home countries. But, they all kind of interplay with one another. And I think, rule of law is one of the most important factors kind of for all of these things. So, INL, like I said, trains prosecutors, anti-corruption prosecutors, for example, in the region on producing, developing cases that they can bring before their country's, judicial system. We train judges as well. Another bureau, the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, we reference PRM. They provide a lot of assistance to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR. Which is critical to providing safety, humanitarian assistance to refugees who are fleeing, insecurity or fleeing violence, political violence, and all of those efforts kind of form part of the department's kind of overall strategy. There's also other kind of initiatives such as, more recently, like Josh mentioned, the Central America, mobility. But if you think even back some years. The CAFTA-DR, which is the Central America and Dominican Republic Free Trade Agreement, the State Department's Economic Bureau has a part in that free trade agreement. But, supporting economic development, also means supporting trade in the region. So that's another way that we kind of the U.S. Department of State are trying to address, these sources of migration. And that's been going on for years. So, there's many different facets to, the refugee crisis through global migration. And we're just constantly trying to find ways to kind of treat it kind of in a holistically as a whole of government approach. Thanks.
Thank you both. And our final question before we go to our chat questions. So working on these issues like trafficking in persons can have an emotional impact on all of us. So how do you manage this, and how do you maintain a balance in your life? And I would like to ask this question first to Amy, and then Ryan and Kayla.
Thank you, Lucia, for asking this important question. So our office works with the Human Trafficking Expert Consultant Network. And through the network, our office offers training to our staff on trauma-informed approaches, as well as training on vicarious trauma, so that staff can learn to recognize and cope with the secondary trauma that they may experience through repeatedly reading about horrific accounts of sex and labor trafficking and interacting with survivors while in the field. This training gives staff the knowledge they need to recognize vicarious trauma, understand its effects, and interrupt disruptive thoughts related to these stressors through resiliency and self-care techniques. At an office level, we're also just a very tight-knit community, and we're supportive of each other. We give staff the opportunity to give readouts of their trips and discuss their findings, and this gives them an avenue to talk about their experiences and express their feelings about what they have observed. We also support employee wellness programs. For example, our office recently arranged to have the employee counseling services offer a brown bag with our staff to highlight the free and confidential counseling services available at the Department of State. And lastly, I'll just add the staff in our office is deeply motivated by our mission to combat human trafficking, and that motivation and commitment helps us endure.
Thank you, Amy. Ryan, Kayla?
This is a tough one. We say in my office, crush the job, don't get crushed by it. We interview victims weekly. Just last week, we were in an interview session that lasted 6.5 hours, and what we received from that interview was pretty horrific. I think about my wife this week as she sits on the task force for American Citizen Services and Consular Affairs, and you can see it. You can see she comes home with it. You can see having to view pictures of loved ones. Both is my loved one okay, and then discovering a picture that shows that they're deceased. It is not an easy thing. The majority of people that live and work in the United States have regular jobs, and they don't ever get exposed to this. They can see it on TV and they can consume it as they want. And I think it's important, first and foremost, to be honest with yourself when you're picking a career. I was a combat veteran in Iraq and saw a lot of things there. And I recognized in myself that I had some of that resilience, and that if I took care of myself and I followed all the resources that are given to you instead of just ignoring them, that I would be okay. So going into this line of work and serving the government, you're going to come across these things. It really doesn't matter what you do. You could be a political officer at post and think that you're going to write cables until you're on duty as the consular duty agent or the embassy duty agent, and get a call on somebody's worst day of their life, that a loved one has been killed or has been kidnapped, and you have to get involved in this situation. I supervise numerous agents that do this. I've watched soldiers over the years, and the most important thing is to sprint when you feel good and give it 100%, but know when it's starting to mount on you, and take that time. Build teams, as Amy said. Great. It's awesome that we all can telework, but sometimes we need to be together and see each other. We need that. We need to feel that community and that team effort. The best teams I've ever been on are ones that were stuck together in a war zone or on the outposts of Peshawar at the consulate. Those were the most tight-knit teams. And it's so important because very typically people that have the hardest time dealing with this and the people that show the most emotional scars, they weren't advocating for themselves. They weren't seeking help for themselves. It's about that partner seeing it in you. right? I see it in my spouse, so I can have that conversation and I can pull her back a little bit. She can see it in me. I can see it in my teammates, and I can talk about it to them and pull them aside and talk to them about it. They can see it in me. So it's very important not to isolate yourself. That's all I can say is the biggest thing I've seen. Unfortunately, suicide is a big issue in diplomatic security, in the U.S. military, in the United States in general. And I would see it every time when you look back at it, there was this level of isolation. There was a level of concealing your feelings and what you're going through to the people around you. And once they can see that, they can address it. So my big takeaways are, you'd be surprised who does really well in this job. I've seen some people that would appear to be very, very, very tough that don't do well after a victim interview, or don't do well, interviewing somebody who has just lost a loved one or just been the victim of a sexual assault. I've seen people that I thought would not do well show unbelievable resilience. But either way, all of us, whatever that threshold is, however high we can let that cup go, we have to bleed it off when we can, and we have to rely on each other. There are no army of ones in this at all. It is a community, it's a group, and that's the only way we can support victims. I always tell my people, if you don't take care of yourself, you can't take care of somebody else. But before I move on to Kayla, one thing I will say is that you can really bounce back quickly with just one really successful case, right? One person that you help and you have drastically changed their life can somehow erase 30 hours of horrible interviewing. So the rewards are in there that are definitely worth what we go through.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Kayla?
Yes, thanks, Lucia. I'll hop in. So as advocates, we absorb on a constant basis daily trauma of others, and we take that and amalgamize it into hopefully something beautiful, but it takes a toll. Every person we touch, we absorb, as you identified with the partners who've spoken, that vicarious trauma piece that we have to, in ways, mold before we can change and give the person that innate support they need to pick themselves up and move forward. So several things I am very keen on doing. First, constantly monitoring my staff and even others. I see everyone in this agency and in this department as individuals that if they need our support, you have it 100%, and we will find a resource. We will find whatever you need, whatever comes out in the bouts of trauma that we all deal with. As mentioned, I'm a therapist, and I've pushed very stringently for my permanent staff to have that therapeutic or that counseling background so that they bring that with their whole selves when they come to these issues. It is very important to have not just the desire to work these types of cases, but the technical understanding and capabilities of knowing in yourself what it looks like to be traumatized so that you can build internal tripwires to ensure your own resilience. So in identifying issues with my team, I'm constantly doing debriefs. I am constantly doing what therapeutically I know individuals need to be whole and to be able to fortify themselves enough to push through the grind daily of giving and being a helping professional. Many people have mentioned resilience. Those factors can be learned, but also a lot of it is innate. And knowing and letting people identify if they need to recuse themselves from an issue, there's no shame. That's a position of strength. To say that this is beyond what I'm capable of tackling, and to say that someone else may be more proficient or I need that balance in going forward, adds to the strength of a case or to the capabilities of the government to support individuals. So I push for people to identify their own resilience and raise their hands when they need help. We also constantly do trainings every year, I make sure we have a vicarious training component. We're actually planning one in November, which we will present to several of our DS entities that have asked for it, but I'll make it available to other agency partners as well. So we bring in experts to talk about that vicarious training piece and how you can build in supports as cases evolve and investigate. And then again, just focusing on outcomes. Ryan mentioned the accolades that can come with success to counter some of that trauma. And we do that very often within our team. We celebrate victories. When I hear good news of a survivor who we found in a very bad place, who now is on their feet and thriving, we talk about it and we, high five everyone who touched that person to pour into them to gain their feet and their legs underneath them. So being mindful of ourselves, mindful of what capabilities are there, giving resources to others and using them when they apply to us is what has been the most important piece of building resilience, being mindful of other people on the team and shoring each other up constantly.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kayla, and all of you. So I'm going to go through, I think we only have time for probably one question from the chat. And this question is directed to Josh and maybe Amy as well. So migrants can become victims. You mentioned that migrants can become victims of trafficking in persons. So they're asking for a specific example on the linkage between migration and trafficking in persons. If you have one specific example.
Sure, I can start and Joshua can add to it. But I mentioned how during the course of the migration pathway, for example, you can take the African continent and there's different migration routes. There's like the Western migration from West Africa north through the desert and then into Europe. And somewhere along that route, oftentimes in Niger, is usually about the time that a migrant might run out of money and then find him or herself in a very vulnerable situation. And at those times, sometimes the migrant might fall prey to a smuggler, and that's where there's kind of the transfer between a trafficking case to a smuggling case, the migrant might be forced to engage in a commercial sex act or engage in forced labor to kind of pay off the next leg of the journey. And I'll turn it over to my colleagues here if they want to elaborate.
No, I think thank you, Amy, for that example. I think like when I first hear this, I think of when you're a foreign national in a country, right? There's a lot of hurdles sometimes to accessing justice systems and traffickers who want to use that maybe hesitancy, fear. Exploit that. I also know if you're dealing with, let's say, refugee populations. I heard one police officer at a conference, officer in the U.S. talking about the outreach they do to populations who may not have had traditionally the best relationship with law enforcement, and thought, what can I do as a police officer to build that bridge so that I'm not just talking about trafficking, but any crimes, right? That they feel safe reporting that to authorities. And this officer knew that that wasn't their first instinct, and they wanted to hear about these cases. So I think these are some of the challenges when you're a migrant or a refugee in a different country. But also, I think another nexus is something that we didn't mention as much as deceptive recruitment. I was recently on travel when I was working in Amy's office alongside Lucia, and I was asking someone, how do you know when it's someone is being deceptively recruited, potentially to a trafficking situation, rather than smuggling? The person basically said, if they tell me that they're going for a job offer in this country that did not sound real, like the salary was too high for the type of work, especially in that country, they're like, we know, or we have a high reason to suspect that this person is being deceived and is not really fully aware, rather than the people who are just trying to migrate using any means necessary. So I think those deceptive recruitment and all of the fraud that traffickers use to coerce people into their schemes, I think it's helpful to also go back to a lot of the recruitment challenges, which I know JTIP addresses robustly.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amy and Josh. And really thank you to all our panelists for being here with us today and for all the impressive work that you do every day to address these important issues. I hope all the audience, they learn a little bit more about the background work we do here at the State Department to address these important issues like combating trafficking in persons. I think we're at the end. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you very soon.